I'm your host, Mimosa.
And co-host, Kareem.
Welcome to Sometimes We're Bougie and Sometimes We Hood, to healing, navigating grief. It's a podcast dedicated to exploring the complex emotions of loss, the road to healing, and the strength found in remembrance. Welcome in, everybody. Come on into Sometimes We Bougie and Sometimes We Hood. I'm not sure where Cousin Kareem is at this point in time. Welcome in. Sometimes We Bougie, Sometimes We Hood. I am your host, Auntie Mimosa. I'm not sure what's going on with Cousin Kareem and where he's at, but he'll come on in this room sometime or another, and y'all will hear him. Welcome in, TikTok fam, Facebook, YouTube. Who else is out there? Instagram, everybody. Welcome in. So this episode explores the connection between grief and organization. The goal is not to shame anybody for messy home, missed appointments, piles of paperwork, or emotional overwhelmness, right? Instead, the episode reframes like disorganization as a possible grief response. So a lot of people don't understand that grief affects everything we do. Sometimes it shows up as trauma response, depression symptoms, executive functioning, challenge in survival adaptation. Oh, here's Cousin Kareem now. Let's see. Come on in. Hey, Cousin Kareem.
Hey, how you doing?
What's good?
How
What's
you
good?
doing? How y'all doing?
Everybody is good.
I'm
Welcome
good.
in. And they say, welcome to Sometimes We Bougie. Oh, bless you.
Sometimes we hood.
Yeah. So
I'm late.
Hood. Because you hood, right? So this episode balances emotional insight, practical tools, humor, realism, and grief informed encouragement. So today's topic is, it's about grief and the mess around us, right? Grief, clutter, and trying to hold life together, right? So with that, we're going to jump on in here. So, we all know grief can overwhelm us, right? And most people, when they grieve, a lot of times you want to hold on to memorabilia from your family, right? So, and again, a lot of these episodes that come up, it comes up because of something that's going on in my life, something that's going on in Cousin Kareem's life, and we feel it's important to talk about it, right? So today we're talking about something people do not discuss enough. And we always say this, a lot of these topics that come up, people do not discuss this enough, right? And that is grief and organization. Not just organizing your closet, not just buying bins from wherever, Walmart, Target, the bin store that you never ever use, right? Not just color coding your planners with pretty labels and stickers and things of that sort. We're talking about why grief makes people overwhelmed, why trauma makes simple tasks feel impossible, why some people can care deeply and still struggle to stay organized. I'm one of them. I consider myself to be a highly organized individual, right? But yet sometimes over the course of the years, I've hoarded, right, some family items that I didn't want to throw away because they belong to a loved one. And I'm just holding on to stuff, just holding on to stuff. So today, that's what we're talking about: grief in organization, and like why your messy room may actually be telling a story, or why that junk drawer may actually be telling a story, right? So, with that being said, cousin Kareem, why do you think like organization and grief, how do they play hand in hand? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's just the mindset. I was told years ago that when you're organized, your brain is more organized. When your room is a mess or your rooms or your house is a mess, it shows your mental state. And I
Mm-hmm.
do that to myself when I focused on making my bed in the morning after I got out of it. When
Mm-hmm.
I focused on putting things back in certain places. It comes down to it, your
Right.
life becomes easier when your things are organized because you're not wasting time looking for certain things when you need
Mm-hmm.
them. Because you can see where they are, you know where they are, because you get in that habitual state of putting things back where
Right.
you know they are supposed to be. And then
Mm-hmm.
you don't really have to use as much brain power to try to remember where these things are when you need to call upon them.
Right. Right.
And that
Okay.
makes a big difference, you know?
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to waste time.
Right. Definitely. Definitely. And sometimes people think that grief only looks like crying, right? Welcome in. Welcome in. The Proverbs 31. Welcome in. Thank you for joining. Sometimes we bougie, sometimes we hood. But it's not just the crying, right? Sometimes grief looks like laundry on the couch for 3 weeks, unopened mail, losing your keys every day, right? Forgetting your appointments, medical appointments, whatever, business appointments, starting or staring at the dishes that's too overwhelmed to start, right? That's what it can look like. Grief can make your nervous system tired. And
Mm.
when your nervous system is tired, organization becomes very hard. It becomes challenging. It does become, difficult to maintain, right? So, we understand that grief is not just emotional pain, it's neurological, it's physical, it's physiological, it's spiritual and behavioral, right? And one of the biggest misconceptions about grief is that people believe grief only affects emotions. In reality, grief can temporarily disrupt the brain's ability to organize, prioritize, remember, initiate tasks, and maintain routines. And that is why, like,
Yeah.
grieving people begin struggling with the things they once handled so easily. So, for example, when Deej passed, and of course, I'm coming up on his 5 year anniversary, transition anniversary. That whole
Yes.
year, my brain was in a complete fog. Even though I went to work, it was like I was forgetting stuff at work. Like my brain, I was like, what am I doing? And then I also worked with a nonprofit organization, right? The Girls Who Brunch Tour organization. And then shout out to Dr. Nicola Mitchell. She just recently lost her dad, you know, and she actually made me sit down
Sorry to
for a
hear.
year. Yeah, she made me sit out for a whole year. Because like right after, Deej's tragic transition, then my grandmother transitioned like 4 months later. But she made me stop working with the organization for a whole year because I couldn't gather my thoughts. Like I could not get myself together to keep doing the things that I used to do for her. I was still like going to work, trying to operate at work, trying to run, help her run the organization. And my brain was just I was all over the place. And she was like, no, you need to take a sabbatical and sit down for a year. And I was like, oh, I can't stay out a year. I need stuff to do. She was like, no, 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 no. Go have a seat somewhere. So I had, I did, and I'm kind of glad I did that. So, because grief impacts concentration, it impacts memory, motivation, and energy, and people don't understand that. So let's like talk about that grief and concentration. Like grieving individuals often, a lot of, like they said, we often describe brain fog, feeling mentally slow, right? Difficulty focusing, rereading things repeatedly over and over again, because you'll read something and you'll be like, did I just read that? And then you have to go back and read the same thing again. Welcome in, welcome in. Sometimes we bougie, sometimes we hood. Then you zone out during conversations. You can have a conversation with somebody and brain just go blank. Just blank. Like, and then you're like, what are we talking about? Or you forget what you're talking about, right? Forgetting like what you're doing mid-task. Like I said, you could be doing something, be like, why am I doing this? What am I doing? You ever have that opportunity, not opportunity, but that experience where you walk into a room and you're like, why did I come in here? And then you have to walk back out the room, and then you're like, oh, I came in here for, So the brain becomes preoccupied with emotional processing, stress responses, intrusive thoughts, and survival adaptation when you're grieving. And a grieving person may appear distracted, careless, or unemotional, when in reality, their cognitive resources are overloaded. Your brain is overloaded. Welcome in. Welcome in. So, Cousin Kareem, like, did you experience that when you lost your mom? Like, that brain fog or that clutter that you had going on, you may have had going on at the time?
I don't know if I had that. I think I was more my emotional statistics were like higher.
Okay.
On examination, it's like every time I had a thought, my emotions were with that thought. It was just like it combined itself to an emotional thought, I guess is how you want to say it. And I tried to hold back from having those emotional thoughts, because you have an emotional thought that makes you traumatic. Everything is traumatic, and it's just it wasn't what I really needed to do. Like I had to go all the way back to New York, came back to Hawaii, and then my job let me go because they said that it would be better for me. And I'm like, I need to work. Like I need to pay bills. Like, why would you think that you don't need to work? No, this is just what you need to do. And they kept trying to convince me of that. And I never understood that. But I got a better job, and that was the benefit of that. They pushed me into another avenue. But it's really weird just trying to control your emotions, which a lot of people, when they don't control their emotions, it leads to an outwardly attack. And
welcome in.
I didn't, for the first time in my life. Usually I used to respond emotionally, physically, but this time I just took a step back and I said I can't allow myself to do that. But it was difficult, in the era that I was in, to not do that. It was extremely difficult because I didn't know anything. It's like, why did my mom pass? Why did it pass so early? Why did, all these questions. And, then one day I just got the message that she had, this is for me. Like, she had to go. She had to go on. And it gave me a sense of peace. It's like she came to me in a dream and was like, just let it happen. And I just let go after a couple of months.
Right,
It
right,
wasn't immediately, but it
right,
was. Yeah,
right.
it was just something that just had to happen.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah.
So welcome into
How was it
sometimes
for
we
you?
yeah, it was different. Like what I experienced. So welcome into sometimes we bougie, sometimes we hood. If you're just joining us here, cousin Kareem and I we're talking about grief and organization, right? And how grief affects organization and the mind and trauma response. And so like for example, like a person could be sitting down paying a bill and then suddenly remember like the hospital room, the service, the breakup text, the diagnosis, the last argument they had with someone they lost. And now like their nervous system is activated and the brain like shifts away from the task. And then,
Mm,
like talk about functional survival mode, right? You going to work, but home is chaos and or you're helping everyone else while your personal life just falls apart, and then you appear high functioning while you're emotionally exhausted, right? So and you asked about myself, so I can tell you like when like and we share some similar losses with my sister Siobhan, my older sister Danielle, and like the
yes.
grief behind that. I went through the brain fog, and especially after Deej's transition, because it was tragic. That whole year it was rough, it was really rough. Um and there I found myself sometimes I would be driving and I would like, oh, I'm gonna go to the store, and before I know it, I'm parked at home. It was like I was supposed to be going to the store. You know what I'm saying? So it's like you order. Sometimes certain
Mm,
functions were automatic. You know what I'm saying? They were automatic. Like I just drove home versus going to the store like I was supposed to. And I'd be like, oh man, now I gotta. So I would just have to back out the parking space and drive on to the store and go get what I was supposed to get.
yeah.
Or I would just say, forget it and go, remember to go the next day. Right. So, talk about different, your brain fog and certain things to remember. And I would have to write stuff down. I found myself having to write everything down in order to remember what I needed to do because of the brain fog, because of the forgetfulness, because that trigger, uh his transition triggered my brain. You know what I'm saying? It was trauma. It was trauma. So here's a
Yeah.
question, reflective question. So like, what areas of your life became harder to manage after a loss?
Hmm.
Okay.
Wow.
What areas of your life became harder to manage after loss? And that's something some people don't think about. Some people go into autopilot, right? They go into autopilot. They're not thinking about anything welcoming. They go into autopilot after a transition, after a loss, and they just moving. They just moving. Because sometimes it might be easier for that person to just keep moving, right?
Yeah.
So
I
in
think that's what
grief,
happened with me.
right, you go into autopilot. So in
Yeah.
grief commonly affects short-term memory, task recall, appointment recall, object placement, verbal processing, and time awareness. And a lot of people didn't, they like, what? Like, I didn't think that had anything to do with grief. It does. It really does. And many grieving individuals become frustrated with themselves because they begin to like forget passwords to apps they often go in. They forget names, forget paperwork, dates, comments, medication schedules. And this does not necessarily, this doesn't mean that they're lazy or irresponsible, but the stress hormone and emotional overload can impair working memory, and information processing. It really can. Um, and that's what it does. And like when you think about grief, like compounded grief, that's something that I've shared before that I have compounded grief, traumatic grief, depression, PTSD, caregiver stress, chronic stress can intensify these symptoms significantly. Welcome in. Um, and a lot of people don't understand that. They just think, sometimes people want to, or if they go to someone, they're like, oh, it's depression. No, let's before you want to call something depression or label it that, let's look at grief trauma, and see where that comes from, right? So
Yeah.
motivation, right? How does grief affect motivation? Well, grief often removes the emotional reward from activities. Right. And like tasks that once felt routine may suddenly feel emotionally meaningless or exhausting, like cooking. Now, cooking is my happy place. I think that's one of the things like that it never affected for me. Cooking is my happy place. I love to cook. I love to see people eat. So I enjoy cooking and never allowed grief to stop me from cooking. Okay. That's my happy place. Sometimes like cleaning, it could feel exhausting or meaningless. Answering emails, grocery shopping, even self-care, and something as simple as returning a phone call, you'd be like, oh my gosh, I don't want to do this today, or I don't want to talk to this person. And that's how grief, when it comes to organization and how it affects the mind, can weigh heavy. Like the grieving brain frequently asks, what's the point? That's what it asks. What's the point? And not always about the, and it's not always because the person wants to give up, but because grief drains emotional energy needed to initiate that task, to get you to go, right? That's what it does. That's what it does. um Grief and energy. Grief is physically exhausting. Physically exhausting. The body remains in a prolonged state of like hypervigilance, emotional stress, disrupted sleep, nervous system activation, emotional suppression, right? Um, which can lead to extreme fatigue, headaches, body pain, oversleeping, insomnia,
Mm.
right? Low stamina. And some grieving people are not doing nothing, right? They're using most of the energy simply trying to stay or trying to emotionally survive the day, right? That's what they're trying to do. They're just trying to survive the day. I have to get through this day. If I get through this day, I'm good. That's what they're thinking, right? Yeah. Hmm. What about, we talk about, like, let's go back really quick because, Mother's Day was here, graduation. We talked about grieving with graduates moving to the next level, whatever, wherever they are, right? Because things are going to change, their identity changes. When it comes to like, I want to say like high school graduates, right? The ones, and I'm talking about the ones that's like getting ready to go off to college, right? The ones that are going
Yeah.
to live on campus. Some of it, for some,
Dealing with that now.
right? For some, it's exciting, and then for others, it's like I said, your whole world changes when you're used to being at home with mom and dad, or brother and sister. Everybody's at home. Now you are responsible for you. You're the only adult. Your identity changes. You have to organize majority of your items that you bring from home into this small space that you share with somebody else. So that could become overwhelming, right? Along with trying to adapt and redefine yourself. And that whole, like on in high school, you might have been the popular one, right? Or the most liked person, or you were the high school athlete, and now you're at you starting all over, right? What does that do for you? What does that do, right? Um,
Changes.
it does. It does. And like I said, grief is in every single thing that we experience. So, for example, right, I had a couch that was 20 years old. 20 years old. My couch, it was
Wow.
red. And, that's not color, right? Red. It was 20 years old, and I finally got rid of the couch. I finally threw it away, right? Okay. Oh, there was grief behind
Congrats.
that. There was major, but there was major grief behind it, right? Because so many people in my family sat on that couch, and that couch held so many memories. It held memories with Deej. It held memories of my mom, my grandmother, my dad. You know what I'm saying? It held so many memories of people that sat on that couch that are no longer here, right? And even the ones that are still here, but where they're just in another state, or that friendship has dissipated. That couch held the memories. It held those memories. So, but as a result, yeah, I felt like a release once the couch was gone. But at the same token, like my home was extremely unorganized. I was like, ooh, I gotta get my house in order, right? I gotta get it in order. Um, I kind of had stuff everywhere once the couch was moved. So, and that's what brought this topic on. Like I began to reorganize my home because now I have to bring in another piece of furniture, right? And it's actually my mother's sectional that I'm getting ready to bring into my home. So I have to move things around, right? I have to move stuff around, organize, get rid of stuff that I no longer need, no longer using, reorganize another room to make space. Yeah. So, and it's been a challenge, and that's what I was doing today. And then when I get finished with the podcast, I'm gonna go back to doing that. I'm gonna go back to the organization. I'm going back to to getting rid of stuff that it really has no significance at this time. And then, it's just like, ooh, the grief behind that, right? The grief behind
Yeah.
that. Because I had to go through a bag that I took things out of my dad's Suburban, and I was like, ooh, I'm going through it, and his tools and his gloves. And I'm like, okay, I can't keep everything, you know? I cannot keep everything. So with that, you have to make up your, like, really make up your mind to throw away items and not hold on to everything. You have to. If not, it turns into hoarding. And my space is too small for that. It really is. It's too small for that. It's too small for hoarding. So, what did you find, like, as time went on, Cousin Kareem, like, with throwing away different items? Or do you even hold on to items? Like, do you hold on to items that belong to family members, or no? It's just like, oh, I don't need this.
I try not to, but I try to hold on to like maybe like one or two things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, me and Lay was cleaning up and trying to go through stuff, and I had like this stack of drawers that I had put like my little mental notes and stuff in. I had like 5 drawers, and she's like, "Are you gonna go through that?" Or do you want me to go through that? I'm like, no, I'll go through it. Don't do it. Don't do it. I'll do it. You don't know what I was thinking. And I went through it, and I'm like, I had all these loose books, loose paper. This thing is like 7 years old, and I'm just like,
Wow.
why did I have all this stuff accumulated? And I just never went through it. So spent like the next 2 weeks just going through my paperwork, and it was just loose papers. Just loose papers. I mean, some of them had notes on them, some of them didn't. But I realized I was holding on to what was I holding on to? That's what I realized. I had to ask that question. What was I holding on to? Even the stuff that I had notes on, it was crazy because I had shit. It was when I realized that having to remember what it was attached to.
Right.
If I have to remember, it's not like, oh, I see, okay, instantly it comes to mind. But if I have to try to remember what was holding on to this thing for, it's the same thing with clothes. Like I throw out, I go through my closet probably like every 3 years, and I say I haven't worn this in 2 years, let alone a year.
Right.
I'm like, okay, well, it's going in the bag, and that's why I guess it comes to mind this once in a while. Just do I need it, or am I just holding on to it?
Are you just holding on?
And I put it in those two categories. Yeah, that's when I just let it go because there's no point.
Right.
Right.
Right. So let's talk about like the executive functioning, which sometimes often declines during grief, right? The grieving process, and that the executive functioning refers to like your brain's management system. So, and that's like skills like planning, organizing, prioritizing, time management, task initiation, like emotional regulation, decision making, and then maintaining routines, right? And grief can temporarily impair all of these areas, right? So like a grieving person may, like I say, start a bill or know a bill is due, but can't mentally initiate making that payment, right? Or they start multiple tasks and finish none. They feel overwhelmed by simple decisions. They avoid paperwork because it feels emotionally heavy. And then procrastination, right? Oh, the big P word, procrastination, because their nervous system associates the task with stress, right? And then the brain shifts into survival mode. So when grief becomes overwhelming, right? The nervous system prioritizes survival over productivity. Okay. Survival over productivity. So the brain's focus, the mind's focus, the brain's focus is on emotional protection, it's on threat scanning, stress regulation, and psychological survival. That's what it is on, right? And this is why like grieving individuals, they may become forgetful, emotionally reactive, withdrawn, avoidant. They avoid things, mentally exhausted. And the trauma informed perspective is like the brain is not asking, how can I organize my closet? The brain is asking, how do I survive this pain? Right? So the shift changes the cognitive function dramatically, dramatically. And that's what it's like, how do I get through this? Like, what am I to do to get through this? Right? And small tasks stop feeling small. And this is one of the most misunderstood parts of grief. To outsiders, tasks that may appear very simple, like opening mail, washing dishes, answering the phone, cleaning the room, responding to emails. But to a grieving person, like often these tasks are emotionally loaded. They are emotionally loaded because small tasks represent responsibility, reality, the finality of things, pressure, failure, fear, confrontation with life changes. That's what that represents, right? So, for example, opening mail, right? That might include medical bills, the transition certificate, insurance paperwork, eviction notices, legal reminders, financial stress. So the task is no longer just opening the mail, it becomes emotionally activating, right? Just like trying to hang on to the cell phone, like I had, for example, I held on to my dad's cell phone, and just the simple task of contacting the phone company just to know, to let them know that he transitioned. I didn't want to do it. I didn't do it. I just let the phone go off. No, I just let the phone go off. Hey, Gigi, love and law, how are you doing? But again, welcome into Sometimes We Bougie, Sometimes We Hood. For those of you who are just joining us, myself and cousin Kareem, we're talking about the mess around us and grief and how grief affects organization, right? And how the brain responds to small tasks and how small tasks can seem overwhelming at times during grief and when it comes to organization, right? So let's talk about like trauma control and clutter, right? Different grief responses. Like some people can become hyper organized while others become overwhelmed and just shut down completely. Hyper control grief is like obsessive cleaning, perfectionism, rigid schedules, overworking, emotional avoidance through productivity. So some people will throw themselves into work. Some people will just throw themselves into activities. And I'm one of those individuals. Like the busier I am, the more involved, the more that I'm doing, it seemed like the better off I was. Like it's like I had to stay busy. My mind had to keep working in order for me not to quote unquote grieve or to feel the emotions behind grief, but it didn't always work. It did not work at all. Um because I could be frustrated, and in that frustration would come anger. In that grief, that time, that I was grieving, um and that's what you go through the grieving. Like you said, the grieving process is not linear. It never stops. It's a continuous process. Certain things would trigger grief. And I always felt like the busier I was, the more I stayed busy, the more things that I had to do. And that's how I dealt with my grief. I became the perfectionist. I became the a workaholic through grief, and doing the whole emotional avoidance through productivity. However, the one thing that I can say is that I became highly emotionally intelligent because I recognized when I was angry and did my best not to lash out at people, um, and to just like really regulate myself, understanding that I was in that phase of grief. I was still feeling angry. Okay. And then there is the shutdown grief, right? That's clutter accumulation, procrastination, emotional paralysis, and the inability to start a task. So sometimes, like I said, sometimes clutter is not laziness. Sometimes the clutter is emotional exhaustion, right? And sometimes organization becomes the one thing people can control when everything else feels uncertain, right? That's the one thing they could do. And like behavioral signs often seen during grief, and it's like when you said avoiding mail. People may avoid mail because they fear the bad news. They feel overwhelmed by the responsibilities. Paperwork reminds them of the loss. they lack emotional capacity to process information, right? And those are some behavioral signs often seen as grief, right? And phone calls, right? Stopping phone calls and text response. Grieving people may stop answering the phone because the conversation requires emotional energy. They fear being emotionally flooded. I'm still like my dad's phone is connected. Like I forwarded his phone to my phone. So sometimes people, his friends will call his phone. It rings to my phone. They're thinking he's going to answer and it's me. And there were some people I wasn't able to connect with or contact. And I have to tell them, oh, my dad passed. And it was a month later, right? Yeah. So that was kind of, that was tough to deal with. Um, People, they don't know how to explain their pain, right? Social interaction becomes exhaustion. And many people mistakenly interpret this as rejection when it's actually just an emotional depletion. It's emotional depletion. You don't want to deal with it. They're tired. People are tired, right? Right. So let's talk about like the trauma informed reflection. Okay. Childhood instability when it comes to grief. What do you think that is, Cousin Kareem?
I don't know. I never heard that one.
Never heard childhood instability?
No, I've heard of that, but it's to the I say maybe
Okay. So, like, when you talk about childhood instability, when it comes to grief, poverty, survival habits, grief after like eviction, illness, divorce, betrayal, and like how instability affects organizational habits, right? So, all of this has a play. Like, and here's a question like, did you grow up in chaos? Or did you grow up being punished for mistakes, right? Because both can affect how people organize themselves today, right? So we talk about, like, for example, losing paperwork. Stress affects like attention and organization, and people experiencing grief may misplace documents, forget deadlines, lose important items, and struggle with the filing system. So sometimes, like, that can create additional shame that often worsens like avoidance behaviors through knowing that they may have had some, survival habits, and instability, right? And then there's like they might neglect chores because as a child, that was like the focus on that family. Perfection. You had to clean, you had to make sure things were in order. And like basic household tasks can become overwhelming because that grief impacts motivation, it impacts physical energy, emotional capacity, attention span, right? You was here one moment,
yeah.
next thing you over in this room, and the next room, the next room, the next room. And some people be like, oh, that's the other talking about somebody might have attention deficit order because they might start one room, come out that room, then they're in the kitchen, then they come out the kitchen and they start doing laundry, and it take them all day to clean the house because they're just moving from room to room to room to room. Well, for some individuals, like maintaining a clean home during grief may generally feel neurologically difficult. Like it's like they can't do it. They want to, but they can't do it, right?
Yeah.
And then like trying to keep a routine. Sometimes routines collapse during grief because like that it disrupts predictability and emotional stability. Like sleep schedules, eating habits, cleaning habits, workout routines may become inconsistent or just stop altogether. And I can say, for example, for myself, and I can only use myself, prior to DJ's transition, I was on my exercise bike twice a day. I would get up at 4 o'clock in the morning. I would get on my exercise bike, on my stationary bike. I would ride that for 30 minutes. I would meditate for about another 30 minutes. I would then like read. I had a whole routine. Then when I would come home from work, I would fix me a little something to eat healthy that was healthy. I would get back on my exercise bike. I have not my stationary bike. I have not been on that stationary bike in 5 years after DJ's transition. I have not stepped back into my exercise routine at all since he transitioned and since my grandmother transitioned. I have not. And I keep telling myself, I'm like, oh, I need to get back on. I need to get back on the bike. I need to get back on my exercise. I need to get back into my exercise routine. I keep saying that to myself, right? And it's just like trying to the work to get there, to get to that point, to get to that step. I want to do it. I do. I want to do it because I want to become healthier. So my knees give me issues. So I know if I ride my, stationary bike, my knees won't hurt so bad, right? They say motion is lotion. I want to. I really do. I so want to get back on that bike. I do. But can I get up at 4 o'clock in the morning? Nope. My routine is broke. That alarm go off at 4, and I set my alarm for 4. It'll go off, and I'll roll over. I hit snooze and I'll roll back over. But I know one day I will get back to it because of the fact that, like, cousin Kareem and I, we do this podcast because it's healing. And not only is it healing to those that are watching and listening and learning, it is healing to ourselves. So the more we do these episodes and we talk about the things that are not talked about in grief counseling or grief groups or through grief programs, we talk about the things that do affect everyday people that is not recognized, that nobody talks about. We talk about these things. We talk about them. We talk about grief and finances, grief and organization, grief when a high school student graduates or a college student graduates. We talk about these things because they're often dismissed. They're often overlooked. And that's why we talk about them, right? That's it. That's why we talk about them. And here's a reflection for you. Like, sometimes grief destroys the structure that used to hold a person together. That is a reflection for you all, right? Sometimes grief destroys the structure that holds a person together. Yes, it does. Okay. I'm going to say it again. Sometimes grief destroys the structure that holds a person together. And then sometimes it takes the person in a whole different direction and it gives them something else to do. Like we say, what's my motto? From purpose to pain. From purpose to pain. That is my motto, from purpose to pain. And I believe that that's one of the reasons why I started this podcast, from purpose to pain, to educate the public on the different areas of grief and to like really dig deep and dive in, and not only just work on healing of the general public, but healing of myself. And cousin Karina, I'm sure you've learned a lot of things about grief throughout the year, and we're in year 2 of Sometimes We Bougie, Sometimes We Hood. And that's what we do. We want to educate the public on how grief affects us in everyday life, right? So we're going to touch on trauma control and clutter, right? So a lot of people think organization is just about somebody's personality, right? You probably read the book. What is it? 5 Habits of Highly Effective People. That's the right? That book?
Yeah.
That people tend to want to read, welcome in when they want to organize and kind of get themselves together. However, I would say prior to reading that book, just take a reflective look over your life, right? And see how grief is playing a part in your organization, in your life, in how you move and how you navigate, right? And it's like sometimes some people naturally need Some people are naturally messy. However, when you're trauma informed, or it teaches us something deeper, right? And it's that's like sometimes our relationship with clutter, control, and routines and productivity is connected to survival, right? Because grief changes behavior, trauma changes behavior, and instability changes behavior. I'm going to say that one more time for the people in the back, right? Grief changes behavior, trauma changes behavior, and instability changes behavior. And sometimes the way people organize their lives is actually the nervous system trying to feel safe. There's so many of us who operate in survival mode, and I am one of those people. I operate in survival mode on a daily basis. Okay. That's why I am a firm believer. Therapy. Please get therapy. Go to a therapist. It is amazing. It is amazing. Okay. Um, with the different grief responses, I just touched on this, right? That some people become hyper organized, right? After loss or trauma, some individuals become like intensely structured, right? And that
Yeah.
can look like excessive cleaning, over planning, controlling or attempt to control their environments, becoming obsessed with routines, overworking, micromanaging details, emotionally suppression through productivity, right? Now, this is not always healthy organization. Sometimes it's anxiety wearing a productivity costume or mask, right? Anxiety. Most people don't think
Yeah.
about that. Oh, this person is highly organized. Oh, they're so good at this, but it'll wear you out. It will wear you out emotionally. It will wear you slam out, right?
That's the burnout phase. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Exactly. Right? You burn yourself out. And when life becomes like emotionally unpredictable, some people try to create a physical predictability. Okay, I'm gonna say that again. When life becomes emotionally unpredictable, some people try to create physical predictability. That structured schedule. I'm only can move A, B, C, D, or I only operate 1, 2, 3, 4. That's the only way they know how to move. And if you move something out of place, disrupt their structure, they lose it. They lose it. They just lose their marbles. They lose them all because they're
Yeah.
not able to handle they're not able to handle the either the spontaneity of something. They're not able to handle the unpredictability of how to move. Yeah, it just throws them off. It throws them off, and it just really, and then don't be somebody who's OCD or has PTSD or ADHD in there with that. It's so funny story before we get ready to close. Funny story. So of course, um I work with the homeless population, right? In creating housing stability and working with them. And we did that episode with myself working with the homeless population, housing stability, the grief that they move through as well, trauma that they're having to move through, right? So my I'm paired with a therapist, so as myself as intensive support coordinator / case manager, and then the therapist, right? And it's so funny because both of us are OCD, both of us ADHD, both of both of us extremely organized. And it's so funny because they laughed, my her and another therapist laughed. They were in the office when we were discussing a resident, and I moved my cup and my drink because one of my drink bottles was a little bit out of alignment with my other drink cup, and I'm in talking and in conversation, not paying attention, I actually pushed them in alignment so they were one in front of the other. And they were like, "Do you see what you just did?" And I was like, "No, what did I just do?" They was like, "You perfectly aligned your two drink cups because one was just slightly out of alignment with the other one." And I was like, "Ooh, yeah, yeah, that So, and I don't know, like is
Yeah.
that a form of grief, like grief coping because I wanted everything in a line, like you know what I'm saying? You remember that movie, Sleeping with the Enemy? Where the husband was extremely organized, like towels had to be a certain way, and all the cans and the labels faced all of. Yeah, I'm not that bad, y'all, but I am bad with that. Okay, so cousin Kareem, at this point, what I want to say before we close is that, and this is going to be a part two, definitely a part two to this, because organization and grief do are hand in hand, right? So before we, and I don't know if cousin Kareem is going to make it back in here before we close out, but I do want to say, like, if you're grieving at this point, like if you're really grieving at this point, you find yourself either unorganized or overly organized, just take a moment. Take a moment to take a deep breath and be like, ooh, um, and when grief like enters the picture, right? All those old survival patterns usually get louder. They usually get very loud. And that's why some people start throwing everything away after loss, or while others can't let go of like a single receipt, a shirt, voicemail, a memory. And that's what we're going to talk about like next. Like there's going to be a part two to this. We're going to finish talking about trauma, control, and clutter in the grief process. So, cousin Kareem, any final thoughts before we close out?
I think it's just a matter, for me, it was a matter of accepting. A lot
Mm-hmm.
of times people don't like to accept, especially when you're talking about somebody moving on um, to the afterlife. It's a point of defiance. It's just like, I'm not going to let it. But you have to think of it on their side. Everybody's going to do this. They're going to transition. And understanding that, I understand that they left you, but what else have they left? And if you're the only child or one of the children, it's a matter of they get to a certain point in life that hopefully you can remember
Mm-hmm.
and build off of. That's just the way I think of it.
Right.
Because I know my mom died when she was young. I know people whose parents died. Like my boy, he lost his parents in a Hurricane 1 in Miami,
Mm-hmm.
and he dropped out of school the next semester. He did 1 year, that was it, and he
Mm-hmm.
moved back home. It was just a lot. I think the most important part is establishing where you are in your life
Right.
versus where you are in their life.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you think about where you are in their life, then you're like, oh my goodness, I didn't do this, I didn't do this, I didn't do this. But then when you relate it back to yourself, where you are in your life, just
Right.
as part of the growing nature, how well can you handle the
Mm-hmm.
passing of those that
Right.
you love and care about and those who care about you?
Mm-hmm.
Because I realize that there's two. There's ones that you care about and they care about, and the ones that you just care about. And
Right.
you don't really know how much they cared about you. And
Mm-hmm.
in that instance, it's like now you're trying to figure it out.
Right.
You don't really have anything to base it on. But with a parent, you should know that they cared about you and you cared about them.
Right.
So it's a little more just the identity of that one should be a little more clearer
Mm-hmm.
than on the quote unquote friend
Right.
that you're
Right.
thinking. Also, so yeah,
All right.
that's all I.
That's all you have. Awesome. Well, this has been Sometimes We Bougie and
Hey,
Sometimes
sometimes we heard.
with your girl
Yes,
Auntie
indeed.
Mimosa and
Hey, cousin Kareem. Hey,
all right. And if today's episode resonated with you, with all of you, we love to hear your thoughts. So feel free to reach out, share your story, let us know how grief has shaped your journey. And if you know someone who might need this conversation, please share this episode with them. You can always reach out to us on Instagram at Queen of Life Empowerment or SBSH Grief Podcast. Facebook at Sometimes We Bougie, Sometimes We Hood, or in TikTok, Sometimes Bougie, Sometimes Hood, or SBSH Podcast there, or email Sometimes Bougie, and that's BOUJEE, Sometimes Hood at gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. Make sure you subscribe, leave a review, share this episode with somebody trying to hold life together quietly, and remember, grief is not just about the end of life. Sometimes grief is mourning the version of yourself that could once manage everything and anything. So until next time, be gentle with yourself and with others. And we'll see you next Sunday at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Have a great day.
enjoy, peoples.
It's a podcast dedicated to exploring the complex emotions of loss, the road to healing, and the strength found in remembering.